I want to talk about content development, which I think is a little ironic given what I just talked about art being natural. If art is natural, can I teach you how to develop content? You know what I mean? Is it pretentious or preposterous to say, if there's this thing that's going to come through you and it resonates, and it's a very natural process, and the more artificial it gets, the more cheesy or the more it drifts away from something valuable to people, how can I possibly pretend to show you how to do that? Because won't I be making it artificial by talking about it or trying to create content? And in that case, it's the opposite. I don't want to help you create content. I don't want to say, here's a storyline, or here's how you develop story, or here's how you make it happen. I want to do a little bit more like what Robert McKee does in his workshops on story. He analyzes when things go really well, why they went well. And there is an art to it. There's a craft to it. He's written in his book Story. I've done his 3-day workshop. There's something that he can go and say, this is how it worked. But you couldn't start with McKee and say, here's how you build your story, because that would be artificial. In fact, I've heard people that he's analyzed in their story, and he says, that's a bunch of BS. We didn't do it like that at all. We did it like this, this, and this, and it just popped out. But what McKee does well is he analyzes after the fact and says, this was really how it worked, or this is how things work well. And in that sense, he's an analyst after the fact, not trying to predict how it works. But in the analysis, you're able to look at the thing and say, yeah, there are beats to a good story. There needs to be a flow, and there is a second act climax, and there is things that have to be in place to work well. And knowing those rules, you can break them all over the place when you need to, but you know what the rules are and you know how things work. And so I'm not going to try to tell you how to do a good story. I want to try to analyze the process and then encourage some of the godly elements in that process that aren't mechanical and aren't you're a clone and he's going to move through you sort of thing, but are very intentional. But in order to get to that place, you kind of have to start with the question, is really good art intentional, or is it incidental, or does it just flow out of you? Is it something you're blessed with and you do, or is it something you choose to create and you get intentional about that? What do you guys think? Can it be both? Yeah? Maybe? Yeah? What else? Like going to art school, does that make you a better artist, for instance? Going to film school, does it make you a better cinematographer? What happens in that situation that lines up with the natural gifting? Can you improve it intentionally? Seems like that, huh? And yet, being careful about it at the same time so that the improvement doesn't become the technical side that dominates the creative process, and you're trying to follow the formula. Like, you know, you've got your Robert McKee book on story there, and you've got your old Underwood typewriter here trying to hack out some script, and you're trying to follow the formula. That wouldn't work, would it? At the end of the day, it would look exactly like the process. But at the same time, having read the story or been on set and done different things, you're able to appreciate certain aspects. That becomes part of the filter in you. So it was necessary to be intentional about the learning or the pursuit, so that when it comes your turn to share what's truly in your heart, that you can do that. So what I want to focus on is how art actually is impregnated into us. And in this case, I'm using the visual metaphor of tattooing, that there's something that's innate in us, but there's something that gets impressed upon us by pursuing it that changes how we function and how we create. Because we are not an island, and we're not talented in and of ourselves to do these things outside of an intentional pursuit and a drawing of something through us. And for some of us, that's going to mean experiences that we don't even want to be part of. Like, for instance, when I went through my discipleship training school, and we talked about God as a father, I forgave my dad for leaving when he was 9, and I did all the mechanical stuff, but then I went 8,000 miles in the other direction, thinking I was going into missions. Really, I just ran away into the circus. But I called it mission because I wanted to sort of justify my behavior. The pain was back at home. The fulfillment of the lesson was talking it out with my dad. The prayer and the revelation, that was important stuff, but it didn't change me It just changed my thinking a little bit, which means I had some more head knowledge. I had not changed as a person, and I had not touched the pain. And by not touching the pain and going through that experience, I lacked the reality and the integrity of a holistic life, and therefore what came out of me after that became superficial. My teaching became a little more technical. My parenting was a shock to me because I'm like, why am I like my father? I thought I dealt with that. And all the things that came at me, I kept trying to put out this force field even stronger to buffet the real world around me, rather than having to simply go back through the pain, which was represented by the person of my father, who I should have walked through some of these issues with. And for some of us, it's that life around us, that world around us, that experience needs to impregnate us, because we have defended ourselves so strongly that we've stopped any of the reality of life coming into me. Therefore, I have no story. I have no resonance with pain or truth or beauty or anything, because all I get is up here technically how to do it. And so I shift into my talent, which is never going to be enough. I mean, at your best, you're Michael Jackson. So you need to find the real thing, and that means exposure to the real life around us. And that's going to be one of the main kind of pieces to this whole time with us, is how are we doing in that regard? Not just hanging out with sinners and tax collectors as, an evangelistic method, friendship evangelism, for instance, but being a real person in a real world, in a real fallen world, and being subject to that world, not idiotically and foolishly, but honestly, because I choose not to run away from it. So the real question here is, how does your faith affect your work? How does your relationship with God, the trust that you have in Him, the things you know about Him, the love and whatever else you've received from Him, how does that really affect our work? In the nitty-gritty parts. And for some of you guys, you can go back and analyze some of the assignments you've done. You can go back and analyze some of the creative things you've done in your life. And you can sit back and say, okay, how has God really gone through that process? Not the technical side. 4 spiritual laws goes here. You know what I mean? Like interjecting those pieces of the puzzle so that the results equal this. But the real integral flow, that intuitional flow of something true about God going through something true about what you're creating. Character? That's good. Yeah, so you can say if God's working on my character, that character should express itself in the project, in the relationships, in the money, all that stuff should flow there. That's good.
Like life lessons, can you say?
Yeah.
Like something it's been a constant struggle, it's struggle.
Yeah. So you take the struggle of a life lesson and integrate it into your project. Not like, when I'm done, I'll create the work. When I'm perfect, but actually I can integrate this and my conversation with God and all the embarrassment of that. I love the prodigal son story where the father lifts up his robes and runs towards the son. That's a very embarrassing thing to do for a person in that culture. I mean, I think it'd be embarrassing for any of us having to wear a dress and raise it up as a guy. But in that culture, it wasn't the dress that was the problem. Is that he showed his legs as an elder, patriarch. He just didn't do that. And I love that Jesus brings that part of the story into that. This was his eagerness. This was his vulnerability towards his son, that he got to do that. So, you can't get to that kind of poetry without understanding embarrassment or understanding pain and culture. You don't try to do just the hip culture thing. You do both. So you let the struggle be part of the story. So in that way, faith becomes an incidental expression in our work if we allow it to. But I'm talking about a more intentional thing. How does our faith intentionally draw God in without doing cheese? That's kind of the question that I want to try to answer with you guys. So the main thing is that the story churns inside of us. It does have external influences, it does have godly influences, it has the expression, but it starts by churning inside of us. And the facility that God's given us to do that is to both love Him and to express Him with heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so what I want to do is I want to talk for a minute about those things, that each capacity or each facility that God's given us is a very special tool, which is a lot deeper than what I'm going to cover here. I'm just going to kind of cover what I think are some of the highlights of these facilities that God's given us for this story to churn inside of us. So it's not by any means trying to be conclusive or in-depth. It's just highlighting a few things. And the first one is in terms of the mind, or letting that story be part of our mind or churning inside of our mind. It's using this intrapersonal intelligence. And the intrapersonal intelligence is one of 8 or 9 different intelligences that everybody has. Howard Gardner and a few other people from Harvard have put together this theory that there's not just one intelligence like mathological. There are 9 different things happening in your brain. Each one of them has a region that heats up when you try to solve problems or make things, which is what they describe intelligence as, solving problems and making things. And intrapersonal is one of those things. It's different from interpersonal, which is the ability to relate and to talk to other people like a counselor or a teacher. Somebody can read body language and eye movement and intonation and inflection and then turn that into conversation. That's interpersonal. Intrapersonal is that Irish poet who knows how to see in the deepest, darkest parts of their soul. Or like one person said, the true artist is the ability to go closer to hell than anybody else and come back and talk about it. So that's intrapersonal. It's the ability to, it's actually an intelligence. Everybody has it, but some people are stronger at it than others. What I'm not sure about, like mathological, is how much you can learn these things. So for instance, you can try for centuries to teach me algebra, not going to work. It just will never work. Like I may be able to get it, but I'll never get it in that sense, or fully function it. I could get logic, but I can't get algebra or probably trigonometry. Intrapersonal, the ability to see down into your soul, does everybody get to learn that, or are some people better at it and not at others? I'm not sure. What Gardner says is that these are natural strengths that you have 2 or 3 that you put together, and that's how you create things. You don't use any one in isolation. You might put intrapersonal and spatial together, like I think Stanley Kubrick did a great job of. He had a spatial intelligence. He could see, like an architect, the scene developing, and he knew which lenses to call, and he knew where the dolly should be laid. He got all that stuff down because I think he had a spatial intelligence, but he also had an intrapersonal intelligence. So what we do is we bring all these different things together to make things and solve problems. And we usually put 2 or 3 of our intelligences together, which is also musical, mathological, natural, like a botanist who orders things together, interpersonal, intrapersonal. There's 8 or 9 of them. And all of us have all these intelligences and usually put 2 or 3 together. So if you went through school being told, if you're not mathological, you're stupid, or they called you a dumb athlete, well, part of the intelligence is a kinesthetic intelligence. So kinesthetic, or the intelligence to move, is actually a part of your brain. So the ballerina is using a part of her brain. She's not just physically, muscularly, different. It's an intelligence. So you're not a dumb athlete, you're an intelligent athlete. Or they would say a talented musician. But music is coming from another part of your brain, and different parts as well, depending on how you do music. So you're an intelligent musician. So you put all these different intelligences together, and that allows you to solve problems and make things. Intrapersonal, I think, can be learned to the degree that we can understand our intuition and its place in the creative process. That takes clearing out distractions. That takes learning how to meditate. And we suck at meditating. Because, a lot of us have grown up in environments where a music video or a television cut will be no more than 1.5 seconds. And that's it. Just boom, 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 boom. Constant movement. And then you come into what we call internet time, where everything needs to be delivered yesterday. Like, where's that computer? And all that stuff builds up in our thinking such that it's not fast enough. And if it's not fast enough, you never learn to meditate. Because that's just a distraction to the real game, which is keep me entertained, keep me interested, keep my, attention deficit self active or there. But I think it can be learned. I think it can be developed. And it's a facility that God's given us. And I don't want to say that it's all happening in the mind. But I do think that if we do not learn to rest, meditate, pause, consider, reevaluate, we will never develop the intrapersonal strength that we could have. Even if I may not be as good at it as somebody else, I could still grow it. And need to if I'm to tell a story, because if I can't see it, if I can't articulate it in my mind, then I'm just going to use other things like color grading. Make it more like this, because that'll give this mood, because I didn't put a mood into the thing, you know what I mean? So I use technical things to try to patch my weaknesses. So that's one capacity, the intrapersonal, using the heart. Second one is the heart. And in the heart, it's the emotive side that God has given us. And the emotive side is super, super important. It's something that personally I've struggled with because I've been fairly dry emotionally most of my life. Felt like my dad was kind of like a pirate who just took my heart and buried it at sea when he died. And I can't do anything to get it back. It's just there, gone. And my relationship with him culminated at a certain point where I didn't get to finish, And I feel stuck in a lot of those ways, even though I prayed through things and went counseling and study on the neurology of emotions. I mean, I've been all over the map on this one. But what I've learned is that even in that kind of pain, and some things I think we're just going to die with, and we're not going to fix everything in our lives. But even in that kind of pain, what I've learned is that context can change that. And just a quick story that with me and my oldest son, Josiah, who moved to Seattle to start working in the game industry there, me and him had a lot of tension up until the weeks up until that time, and weren't really relating that well. And when we went to Seattle, I was doing some teaching there, so he came with me, and we were staying in the same room together for like 2.5 weeks. It was like going to camp, So we were just like chatting at night and kind of diffusing some of that tension. But part of my problem is that I'm so cold emotionally that I don't know the difference between heartfelt conversation or when to let something drop and things like that. So I'm tenacious with the wrong things at the wrong time. But this sort of was easing away because the context of our lives was changing. And I've been praying about this for 20 years. And then I went to do some shopping, and I brought the food back into his room because he was upstairs doing something else, and this was going to be his bedroom. And I thought, I'll just pray over his room. I'll just kind of bless it like they used to do in the old days by putting the hand under the thigh and saying, speaking out stuff. And as soon as I went into the room, context hit me. That this was no longer my son in my house. This was my baby now growing up. He was my firstborn. Now growing up, this was his place. It was different. It was separate. And something broke inside of me, and I cried for the next 3.5 hours. Half an hour there, finally excused myself, almost getting in accidents on the way home, could barely see. Went to my room, cried for another 2 hours. And in the context of that change, of him being in his own place and me releasing him, broke years of me trying to work out stuff in my head and how this works. If I didn't have that context, I wouldn't have had that change. It's a long, slow process. But it's healthy and it's real as long as you stay in the game, as long as you stay in context. In this case, staying in relationships and being willing to risk having children when you don't feel that much, and pissing off your wife half of her life because you don't respond emotionally the way she'd like you to. Just staying in the game anyway until you slowly form. So even in the hardest of situations, the emotive side can come through if you stay in context. If you have a healthy emotional aspect, or what they call an emotional intelligence to your life, then you're in a good position because you know how to exercise passion. And passion is like a sponge. It comes in and out of us. And learning how to receive from passion outside of us and learning how to be passionate with what you've got is a very strong element for 1,000 different reasons. From holding you to the story so you don't let go of it, giving you grace in the down times when things aren't working, but you need the passion to kick at it anyway. Or being able to identify with the pain and the emotive stuff around you so that it can express through you in a proper way without drying up along the way because you don't get that part of life. So it is a capacity that's super, super important. One of the things I think that we've left behind in our Gnostics thinking of the last century is that we've thought certain parts of us aren't important anymore. See, Gnosticism says your spirit is good and everything else is evil. The material world's evil, emotions, don't need them, sexuality, only for procreation, It just kind of dries everything up into this common shell so that everybody gets into heaven fairly safely. And so we've lost touch with all these other aspects. And as Christians, the ability to be emotive is kind of weird. I was listening to worship this morning, and I often do, and I'm hypercritical, so you have to take this with a big grain of salt. But I was thinking about the whining spirit of worship. You know, there's kind of this tone, this, we love you. You know, there's this thing, this spirit to the thing. It's like, how do I express it? Well, you heard it, so you know what I'm talking about. But there's this sort of, it's a whine. It's not a song. It's not a new song, definitely. And it gets repeated ad infinitum because I think we're trying to bring emotion through the repetition somehow. That's going to generate some kind of activity or action in the spirit. And that shows you immediately the weakness of the thing. And I'm not just talking about here, I'm talking about almost everywhere that I've gone. I've seen this spirit of whining and emotion, this spirit of codependency, this inability to either scream because you're frustrated as hell and you finally get to do it before somebody who cares to listen, like God, or you're doing great and you know how to express that in a number of different ways. And I'm not talking about just dancing before the Lord and how weird that can be, but really emotive stuff, the kind of stuff that freaks people out, like David's wife got freaked out by him doing. That was emotive. And we need to bring that up a little bit. And I know it's in context, I know it can't be superficially like, I'm going to be all emotional now, and just turn that on. But just to validate it, I'm trying to speak out validation of certain aspects that I think as Christians we've sort of lost or dulled down or dumbed down, and in some way that'll definitely affect our story. But it is a gift. It's a very, very important gift. And that part of the gift that I wanted to really highlight on, because I think it's where we're short on, is passion. The ability to express passion, to understand its place and not be afraid of it, but realize that, you know, if there needs to be a check or a balance to it, you'll get that and you'll know when you're going too far. But don't be afraid to even start because you think passion is evil and will somehow blur the real issue. It won't. It'll heighten and bring it back to life in most cases. So God's given us our minds. He's given us our hearts. Probably I think one of the most important aspects and maybe one of the most difficult is the soul. And the soul is the ability to identify. Most cultures put the soul somewhere in your stomach, you know, down here where your bowels are. Because there's something in that intuitive place, that place of feeling, that identifies. Empathy, I don't think, is a mental thing. It is partly emotive and part of the emotional intelligence, but I think the connection for a lot of these things happens in the soul. There's a peptide called oxytocin. Oxytocin is a thing that gets released. It's actually a reproductive hormone. It's a thing that gets released when you trust somebody. And so neurologists or biologists now can track the biology of certain chemicals in our brains and how they react. And they've got, you know, complex tests like me and David could be somewhere in a room in a computer lab and not know it, but part of our testing is going to be if something comes up on my screen and says, of the $10 we're giving you for sitting here, would you like to give it to this other person who you do not know and you've not met? Would you like to give some of them to them? And whatever you give to them will get tripled. And maybe they'll give some of that back. And so each test case has to figure out how much they're going to give away to the other person. And trust that person to maybe give something back. Or just do it to test and see. And they found that when they do that, and then part of the lab experiment is as soon as they've done that, they get called in to take blood. Because oxytocin has like a 3-minute half-life and then it starts to drop off. So they have to take blood immediately, and then they can see how much oxytocin is related to how much money they gave away. And there's a correlation. Then they found that they can give a nasal burst of oxytocin, and that'll bump up the trust factor.
Is that like truth serum almost?
No, it's not that powerful. In fact, the DoD, the Department of Defense, turned down funding on this particular thing because it's a subtle change. It's perceivable, but it's subtle. It's not like I can control you with this. Even though after I learned about this, I started on my little story ideas. You know, okay. DoD takes oxytocin to interrogate, you know, and then they start putting it out like Soma in Huxley's Brave New World. Had all kinds of ideas for this. But it's a very subtle thing. But it is perceptible. My question is, what releases that? And what's the connection between that and, say, faith in God or trust in other people? Is that chemical, or is there something else that happens? And I think one of the undeterminable parts in terms of science is this thing that says that your soul is more valuable than the whole world. There's something there that God has given us as a facility that is super, super powerful. And as such, maybe, and I don't know, it may have a correlation to the release of these different hormones like endorphins or oxytocin or different things that get you to act, but it's not the source. Those hormones aren't the source of that thing. It is something else that inspires you. Something's willing to trust or give something to somebody you don't know for their betterment, and you get nothing out of it. Why do you do that? What's philanthropic, or what's truly altruistic? And does that come from the mind or the heart, or does it come from the soul? And there's this capacity there that if you could register with it and understand its power, and I think part of the power of the soul is the ability to identify something that resonates inside of us. Jung calls it, in terms of story archetypes, it's universal consciousness. The Bible calls it eternity in our hearts. There's something there that resonates right at that deep place. And I think it's that ability to identify. And I think the Trinity expresses that within the Trinity, and then expresses that to us in a lot of different ways, like incarnating Jesus and stuff. But it's the ability to identify with other people that resonates and connects the village. And that is an issue of the soul. So how do you foster that? How do you develop that? That's one of the things I want to talk about with you guys, because I think it's a strength and a powerful thing in the right sense to help weave and develop this concept of story. Wow, that's really dark compared to what I'm seeing on my thing. Madeleine L'Engle wrote some journals called the Crosswick Journals, and she wrote about her process of writing, and in this she talks about intuition and the soul to a degree. She said, the concentration of a small child at play is analogous to the concentration of the artist of any discipline. So she's saying a child really focusing is very similar to an artist really focusing on their work. In real play, which is real concentration, the child is not only outside of time, he's outside of himself. He's thrown himself completely into whatever he's doing. A child playing a game, building a sandcastle, painting a picture, is completely in what he is doing. His self-consciousness is gone. His consciousness is wholly focused outside of himself. So there's something in that focus that comes into this next aspect of using your strength, using the expressive side of you. And part of that is this being lost in the expression and being able to let it flow through you, whether that's writing or performing or creating a song or composing. There's this other thing that you're doing, but you're using yourself to express it. But there also, I think there's a trick to this, and that's being centrifugal. Rookmacher coined this term in terms of art when he said that in the old days, the artisan of the past was a centrifugal artisan. They didn't do art for themselves, they did it for the community. So the guy that chiseled that face in the Strasbourg Cathedral was going to put it 50 meters up in the air where nobody could even see it back then. But he did it just to bless the community and to bless God, not for himself. In fact, there are 3 generations of families that worked on these cathedrals over some 300 years. So a lot of times, for instance, you know those beautiful old wooden oak, I don't know if they call rectories or whatever the elders used to sit in these large cathedrals where they're all hand-carved seats with figures all in them. Well, these would be massive logs of wood that the father's father would put into a salt bath for over 100 years so the grandchildren would carve it. So this is a centrifugal approach to being an artisan, that I'm going to create something with us, for us, not for me. Centripetal is where all the energy spins back into the central, and I do it for me. So this is Andy Warhol in his silver, factory, in his place where everybody's creating stuff, but he's taking in all the money and getting all the glory and being very stingy and selfish about it along the way. Centripetal. So you move from guild to studio. Guild is where we make things together. Studio is my name, my place, my money. And I narrow it down to the common denominator, so no doubt goes to Gwen Stefani. You know what I mean? Just keep weeding out all the pieces into the individual thing. Centrifugal is I'm going to express this for you, not just for me. I need to because I need to be expressive, and it needs to come out of me, so I'm part of the problem, or part of the mix. I'm not here, but I'm doing it for you and for us. That's centrifugal, and that's when you've got some very powerful communication, is when it's being expressed. In this way, the craft is, in a sense, molded a little bit by the marketplace around us because you want it to resonate with people, but you're not heavily guided by it, but you're not so into yourself that it doesn't matter whether people get your art or not. That's a centripetal approach. So it's really putting all these different things together, heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's part of this internal process. And I think each one of them needs to be developed. And it's not that we can be uber people, with everything functioning perfectly. But if you know that something's lacking, and there's some blocks in that, there's probably something we can do to improve that. So we're not an island. We must live in context, but within ourselves, there are some powerful tools that God's given us, heart, soul, mind, and strength. When they're functioning together, they're really great.